Hi everybody and welcome back. I'm talking to you today about chapter 2, which is psychobiology. So for this chapter, it's really understanding how the brain interacts with us in a psychological perspective. A lot of people understand the right side of our brain controls the left side of our body, left side controls the right. But there's much more to that. And hopefully you've read through chapter 2 and you see that there's many different areas of the brain that are going on. More so than just left and right, which is really the important piece for you to understand for this chapter. It's not relating it in medical terms, but psychological terms. So when we think of the right side of our brain, and I think you're looking at this opposite, but when we think of the right side of our brain, we that's responsible for music, that's responsible a lot for that creativity. um, it also has to do with a little bit of the understanding of language, whereas the left side of the brain is more logical, written language, actual spoken language, reasoning, logic, sequencing, a lot of those kind of concrete things, where this is kind of more creative and analytical. So when you do your paper, you can go simply with left and right side of the brain, but definitely think of going more in depth as I'm looking at my notes. We have the forebrain, we have the midbrain, we have the hindbrain, and then there's different areas of those. When we think of right here, our frontal lobe, which is right in the front, um, a lot of the key term right now is executive functioning, and everybody doesn't have executive functioning skills. And the reason why people aren't making progress because of executive functioning skills. That's responsible, our frontal lobe is responsible for a lot of those regulation skills. Um, a lot of people don't understand too that that is the last area of the brain to actually develop. So when we're trying to reason, when we're trying to understand things, this is the part of the brain, the frontal lobe, that comes into play. However, that is also the first part of the brain to shut down when we're experiencing stress or anxiety. I'm sure we've seen people go into panic attacks, people who have anxiety disorders. We often say, oh, their perception's off, it's not that big of a deal. They're not accessing the area of the brain in order to reason and to use logic. And, working with students, working with adults, that's our job, is to help them find that reasoning, help them access that area of the brain instead of going into these patterns of behavior that are really just ineffective overall. And it takes work. You'll see underneath the discussion board, I have a video about plasticity of the brain. We definitely can create new pathways to our brain, but it takes work. It takes work, it takes time, and it takes effort. Think about if you're going out for a walk in the woods. I have tons of Audubon trails behind my house, well-worn paths. They're easy to follow. I can go out there with my family, whether we go hiking in the summer, we can get the snowmobile trails out there. I can snowmobile to Canada because we've got well-created paths that are out there that were here forever. I mean, a lot of these are mill trails and logging trails that we're following. However, there are some trails off the beaten path. Anybody who hikes, you kind of look for the colors on the trees. And I see those colors on the trees. However, as I look, some of those times I can't even figure out where the path is. Not a path personally I'm going to take, because I'm not one to be lost into the woods. But it's going to be difficult and it's going to be hard, and I'm going to have to pay attention. And I'm going to have to, use a lot of different senses. So the same thing with our brain. We create pathways in our brain that just become automatic, and they become what we know as habits. Lots of people in January, New Year's resolutions, I'm going to have a new habit. And then it's not so easy to do because we're creating a new pathway, whether it be with exercise, getting that into our routine, getting it to be part of our day, whether it be to stop eating or stop smoking. Again, we're creating new pathways because a lot of things that come with that are habits. People who have anxiety disorders, again, they've created pathways in the brain so everything becomes automatic and they're not using rationalization. So that's what goes on with those areas of the brain. Um, the same thing as when we see people, well, why don't they just access different areas of the brain? When people have injuries, why can't it just be automatic? And sometimes it is, but as I says, it's work. But at the same time, too, we need to remember that our brain is the control system. So, um, I think it's Star Trek that my husband watches, and they've got kind of the captain sitting there, and then some guy in engineering's like, "I can't do it anymore, Captain," and I don't have enough power. And then the captain says, take power from, take all power from life supports and this and that. And so that way they have control of the ship to hold up the shields and get away faster. I don't watch the show too much, but we see that happen. The same exact thing happens in the brain. So um, when we are in a state of crisis, when something happens, our brain automatically takes over. Now, it's not going to take away from our life support systems. It's actually going to take away from other areas of our brain, almost kind of turn them off and send that power elsewhere. When people kind of get into a crisis or a traumatic, experience a traumatic event, there's different areas of the brain that get heightened. So when you're doing your research and say it is, about PTSD, what happens to the amygdala? What happens to the limbic system? What happens to other areas of the brain around that? We look at students, and we look at people with disabilities, when we think of the motor cortex up here, and it's really our motor cortex, we would think would be a huge part of our brain because that's our entire body. But in the reading, you should see that the motor cortex is actually a very small piece of the brain. What happens when somebody has a physical disability? And then we think about, why do they have problems remembering things? Why do they have problems understanding things? Why can't they walk and talk at the same time? Those other areas of the brain, for lack of a better word, kind of shut down. And they don't totally shut down, but they shut down in order for the body to still function as best as it can. So our brains are plastic. We can create new pathways. It takes time and it takes effort, and it really takes a mindset to do that as well. As I was talking about, when we think of our paper that we have upcoming, a lot of people, for example, use strokes. Strokes is something near and dear to my own heart. So what you have to do is I don't want to see a paper about a stroke. What I want you to do is, and I'm going to use stroke as an example, I want you to research what happens to somebody with a stroke. So strokes happen in many different areas of the brain. Sometimes it affects one part, sometimes it affects many parts, sometimes it's global. So I want you to really, really correlate that if there's a stroke, if there's a blood vessel burst behind your right ear, what area of the brain is that, and how is it going to impact somebody? Not just physically, but behaviorally, emotionally. CTEs. We think of people with a lot of concussions. What's happening to them when they hit their frontal lobe? I mean, a lot of people have heard about Phineas Gage. Unfortunately, he was a railroad worker, and had the unfortunate incident of having a railroad being kind of stuck up and came out his frontal lobe. And he was a nice guy, an easygoing guy, a fun guy. He unfortunately survived his injury, but it gave us a lot of information about the brain, because after that accident, he was not a nice man. We've heard about professional athletes, a lot of football players, a lot of wrestlers, unfortunately, who become very aggressive and very violent because of CTE. We've also heard, probably through the media, about some athletes that have unfortunately taken their own lives, but did it in a way that they left their brain intact, so that way it could be researched to further understand repetitive concussions and the impact it has on that. There's a lot of research out there as well about children who are slapped. New Hampshire has their own laws, what you believe or not believe, but there's research out there about the injuries to the brain when children are repeatedly slapped in the face or slapped upside the head. Um, you can also look at trauma. I mentioned that earlier in the video. What happens to the amygdala? What happens to the limbic system when somebody does have? And where are all these areas in the brain located? So when these become heightened, what happens to other areas? How does it impact a person kind of with their personalities as well? So this is really a basis. And I mean, I've seen some people that are they're nurses, some people who are in the human services in this class, which is great. And sometimes it helps to understand, what the impact the brain has. A couple of examples. If I have a student who's had an injury, even at birth on the left side of their brain, I'm going to think, okay, this is one, I'm not a doctor, but how well are the two sides of the brain communicating with each other? What's happening in the cerebellum? What's happening in the hippocampal region? Um, but, when we think about the left side of the brain and this student's having a hard time reading or a hard time spelling, there's a lot of sequencing that goes on with writing and reading and spelling. There's a lot of memorization that left side of the brain is not going to be functioning as well as the right hand side of the brain. They're amazing artists, but are having problems with math. That's something I have to think about. It may not necessarily be a will versus a way, but it may be truly something that's going on in their brain. Another thing that I very often see, students with lead issues. We have many immigrants, so there may not be those immigrants. When we think about what goes on in their countries, they don't have like the same medical kind of the medical care, and they don't have like the same laws and regulations around paint and things like that. So what happens if somebody's exposed to lead? I've had children, that are fully functioning and doing great and this and that, and we can't figure out why they're not learning. Why can't they remember? I do a developmental history and find out that the umbilical cord was wrapped around their neck for 4 days before they were born, and then they need supplemental oxygen for 4 days. That's a lot. And even at birth, everything may be fine, because what are babies supposed to do? Suck, eat, sleep. When they get older, we may see, and it's really hard to correlate, but sometimes you have to wonder, what impact did that have to do? What is the research that says lack of oxygen? So these are the areas that you're researching and how it impacts the brain. So as I said, I don't want a paper about whatever it is you choose to do, whether it be strokes, traumatic brain injuries, whether it be CTEs, concussions, trauma, PTSD, anxiety, depression. Really, all those impact the brain on an ongoing basis. I want you could have maybe a paragraph just highlighting what that is. If you're going to do, sometimes I know there's some Moya-Moya syndrome. Not a lot of people know what Moya-Moya syndrome is. So maybe you want to have a paragraph or two about what the syndrome is. But the focus of your paper should be how that injury, how that syndrome impacts not only the brain, the specific areas of the brain, and how it's going to impact the rest of the individual overall. And think about emotions, think about behaviors, think about personality, and you can think about those physical aspects as well. Like I said, with strokes, there's going to be a lot of impact about, with strokes, a lot of impact is going to be that physical piece. But I think those of you who are nurses also realize that there's a huge emotional factor. There's a huge, personality factor that comes into play as well. What areas of the brain, what is going on in those areas of the brain? So as I said, I'm just checking my notes here. You can always, something to think about too is development, the age, and also the sex. There are sometimes differences there's definitely differences, as I first mentioned, the frontal lobe responsible for regulation and impulse control is the last thing to develop. And it may be like 25 years old before it's actually developed. But other areas of the brain, are very primitive areas of the brain, and they're working right away. So, age and sex can also definitely play a role in the injuries that we have. Um, you may also another brain injury, because a lot of research is coming out with the opioid problem that we have, or epidemic that we have going, especially in New Hampshire. What does the impact of repeated drug use have on the brain? That is another injury, believe it or not, that is ongoing. Um, the research is pretty new on that, but there is research out there, probably enough for you to do a paper on it. So, that's kind of an overview of the brain, what we're looking at. Um, that's an overview of what the paper is supposed to be about. So if you guys do have any questions, you have my email. Feel free to email me. Again, post your papers early. The earlier you get it up, you can start receiving feedback. People can start asking questions. Um, as when you answer those questions, I take that in, or change your paper based on those questions. I take that into consideration as I'm doing your final overall grade for the assignment. Um, Remember, you can post some information if you see something, a great article you think would be pertinent, because there's so much information out there. I can't find it all. I can't supply it all. And sometimes I get great information from students. So if you see something out there that's an article or a news story, feel free to post a link, because that way we can all discuss it and talk about it with each other. I will have up in the discussion board. As I said, there's going to be a video about plasticity, and there may be other things. I'll also have a forum that if you have any questions about the chapter alone, we can definitely post questions there and have conversations about it. So, all of this information, all of this work that you do is in addition. Your basic, as I said earlier in an earlier video, the basic that I'm looking for is for you to put that paper and have it by the due date. But again, the more that you do, the more you're able to show me in writing that you really understand these concepts. Because as we move on, you're going to be using this information as we go throughout the semester. So I hope you guys have a great week. I promise no more multiple videos and multiple announcements unless something major comes up. And so I'll have one towards the end of somewhere around the 26th, 27th, 28th about your next assignment. So you guys have a great week. Email me if you have any questions.